Following is a Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation.
Attorney General David Eby is trying to clean up the gaming industry and casinos. But it's Premier John Horgan who has made the biggest bet of all, that David Eby can handle his enormous workload, get all this stuff cleaned up in time for the next election to get them re-elected.
And good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer, and we do have as a guest on the show tonight, he managed to find an hour in his schedule, the busiest man in the BC government, single-handedly put through some of the toughest legislation last year and busy this term as well, David Eby, the Attorney General.
Hi, Vaughn.
Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
And we don't want to let this moment go by, because if you go back to last summer, the big speculation was how long will this government survive? It was a matter of weeks. People were taking numbers in the pool. And today, Thursday, if you're watching us on Thursday, the government survived a key vote in the House, the confidence measure passing the budget.
Yeah, the budget vote, it felt really good. It's a close margin. The vote was 43-41. And
44-41.
44-41, pardon
yes,
me.
Yeah.
I misspoke. Steve is, for the Liberals, Thompson is out. He's not well, which gave an extra vote, but it is a tight margin.
Yeah. No, and I know the Government House Leader, Mike Farnworth, was joking to us in the hallway that he had spoken to caucus in the morning and advised everybody that it wasn't an optional day for attending. So, but all the Liberals were all there too, as you say, except for the one member who's off on the 6th list. And of course, the Speaker is in the chair, doesn't vote except to break a tie, and there wasn't a tie today. So basically, the government goes for another year, really, until the next budget vote, which will be this time next year.
Yeah, it's really important for us to pass these votes and show that there is confidence in the majority of the members in the House, and we have that, and we're going strong with our budget. It's great.
Yeah, no, it is interesting, though, because very, very activist agenda, and I wanted to ask you about a couple of those things. You're in charge of the Insurance Corporation of British Columbia, and we had the finance minister on the show last week, Carol James, and she said that ICBC finances are in such dire straits that it's one of the biggest risks for her being able to keep the budget on balance for the next 3 years. And since then, since that she was on last week, you did something about ICBC finances by cabinet order. Can you explain the significance of what you did?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really uncomfortable moment when you have to call the finance minister and tell her that the Crown has called and said that the $400 million loss that they were projecting is actually looking more like a $1.3 billion loss. And she managed to balance the budget despite that major challenge. So my thanks to her, certainly. And the work for us on ICBC is pretty clear. They're in a huge financial crisis. What we did this week is we need to have, it's called a meet the minimum capital test, which means that ICBC has to have to simplify it, they have to have $1 in the bank for every dollar in outstanding claims that there are. And if they don't meet that dollar for dollar, then they can't go to the BC Utilities Commission for a rate hearing. They have to get to that level first. So what we did was we removed that regulation because ICBC is not there. They're about 50 cents on the dollar right now in terms of money in the bank versus claims outstanding that they know that are out there. Now, the claims don't all show up at the same time. This is many years out, these claims will be. So ICBC is not facing insolvency or anything like that, but they are not meeting a basic test for a financially healthy organization. And that's really shouldn't be a surprise for anyone. They lost $900 million in the last fiscal. They're targeted to lose $1.3 billion this fiscal. So there's a real crisis. That's why we're moving so quickly to fix it.
The budget papers indicate that there ought to be a turnaround within the next 3 years where it reaches the balance point again. Are you confident you can hit the mark?
Yeah, this is the big challenge, because the reforms that we'll be bringing in the spring in this legislative session, they have to be passed by the legislature. They require implementation by ICBC on the technology side, on the training on their staff side. The Civil Resolution Tribunal is a big part of this. So this is all about how we handle minor injuries. And so that's minor strains and sprains and this kind of thing. We don't think they should be going to BC Supreme Court for a full expensive court process with experts and so on. We've limited the amount of damages you can receive for pain and suffering, but we've expanded the therapy that you can receive, rehabilitation therapy, if you have these kinds of injuries, with the savings that we have there. But they don't kick in until April 1st, 2019. And so there are other measures that we have in place to get some of the costs under control at ICBC, but it is a gradual process. So for all of the accidents that take place up to the implementation date of this new system, we're under the old system with all the costs that come with it.
Another of the files you've been dealing with are the British Columbia casinos under the Lottery Corporation and concerns about money laundering at the casinos. I know you've got an investigation going on that. I spoke to my colleague Sam Cooper at Post Media, who's been doing a lot of stories on this, and he said I should ask you, given the mounting evidence that organized crime has managed to get into the casinos and influence some of the staff there, what are you going to do about it, and how come some of the casinos that are really bending the rules in BC haven't been deregistered?
Well, it's 2 points in response. One is obviously Sam's been doing a huge amount of work on this story, and a great credit to him and to Kathy Tomlinson for digging on these things.
Yeah, at the Globe and Mail.
At the Globe and Mail. They've really assisted the public in understanding why we're making some of the changes we will be making. As soon as there's any indication that someone within a casino that's working within a casino has ties to organized crime or has somehow been corrupted, the Gaming Policy Enforcement Branch will pull that person's license. That is their job. They are a very effective regulator in that way. The issue has been certainly that people bringing in this what are called bulk cash transactions and the casinos themselves, everyone has apparently been under the impression that they are operating within the rules. The forms have been filled out, all the boxes have been ticked, but at the end of the day, it feels like the forms were sent to a warehouse somewhere, were put in a box, and then we never heard from them again. They weren't used. And the concern that I have is around the infrastructure of how we prevent, detect, and prosecute money laundering. That's why I brought in Peter German. He's doing this investigation. He reports by March 30th. And I expect him to have some suggestions for significant reforms in the gaming sector to ensure that the issue that Sam raises about how can we have confidence in the system when people are bringing in a duffel bag full of 20s and no one blinks an eye. They fill out the form and then everything proceeds as normal. I don't have confidence in that system, and that's why we put some interim recommendations in place. And I can tell you that the last report I had on suspicious cash transactions in a month at the casino was $150,000. The reports that were coming in the peak of this activity, July 2015, were in the hundreds of millions of dollars in suspicious transactions. So we've done a good piece of work on the cash, but there are other questions about bank drafts. It's a slippery, it's like whack-a-mole. So and you saw the recent coverage around money laundering in the real estate market with loans attached to titles and so on. So we're making sure that we have the capacity to prevent and detect this before the journalists do, which is a reasonable goal, I think.
I notice in the finer print of the budget where you start to go down and read the plans of the individual Crown corporations that the Lottery Corporation is expecting a drop in revenue because of this crackdown. It's actually going to cost the casinos, and I mean the share that comes to taxpayers, some money.
That's right. So there's kind of an impression that the money that was being brought into the casinos was simply to get a check and to launder it through and make it appear legitimate. It was more complicated than that. The money was being given to people who were coming from China, particularly where there's a currency restriction. They can't bring the money out of China that they'd like to, but they wanted to gamble. So the allegation is criminal gangs would provide them with the cash so that they could go in and gamble, and the gambler would transfer money back in China into a different account that was under the control of the organized crime organization. So they were actually bringing this cash into the casino and gambling with it. And this isn't a big secret, Vaughn, the House always wins. So they were losing money when they were gambling, and BC was making money through this. So in our crackdown on this, we are anticipating that there will be a financial impact, and the impact is significant. We're talking $40 to $60 million of impact because there was $400 to $600 million worth of gambling activity, apparently, that was taking place on this.
The other thing Sam suggested I ask you is, where do things stand in terms of finding out how this money, once it's funneled through the casino or laundered, ends up in the real estate sector, and what are you going to do about that?
Yeah, one of Sam's pieces, and certainly there were pieces of my initial briefing that caused me to be concerned about connections with the real estate sector. One of his pieces talked about self-declared occupations, that people who are doing these large cash transactions, many of them involved in the real estate sector, self-described as involved in the real estate sector. That's why I asked Peter German to tell me if he saw connections between the money laundering that was happening at BC casinos and any other areas of the economy, which certainly includes real estate. We've seen since then Kathy Tomlinson's coverage about the direct impact of the loans on title by some of the same people alleged to be involved in money laundering. Really serious allegations. There are two components to that, our work on that right now. One is this sort of immediate set of allegations around the regulators of the lawyers or the regulators of the Land Title Office and others to make sure that we've got all the pieces in place and that the individuals alleged to be involved in this are going to be held accountable. The other is the systemic reforms. I think we're going to have to go back to Mr. German and ask him to do a second round of reviewing this once he's done this first round on the casinos, and in particular to make recommendations on the real estate sector specifically.
In one of your many interviews on this, you disclosed that British Columbia had gained such a reputation around the world that it was known as the Vancouver model for money laundering. Is that coming to an end? Will we be able to say no longer will we have that appalling reputation around the world?
Yeah, the Premier's instructions to me and certainly my personal goal is that we that we erase that, that we stop that international perspective of how Vancouver operates, and that we become a leader in transparency and accountability around these pieces. I mean, there is no question that gambling in BC has contributed a lot of money to a lot of important organizations across our province, including the provincial government. It pays for a lot of public services. But I don't think anyone agrees that we should be doing that at the expense of our international reputation or in a way that facilitates organized crime. And that goes double for our real estate market, where so many families have been impacted by the housing crisis. So I've got a strong mandate from the Premier to do this, certainly from the public of BC, and we'll be cleaning it up.
Lots of questions on tape for the Attorney General. There's so many different files he's been involved in, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can today. And I'm going to start with Jordan Bateman. Here he is.
Minister, your Premier backed down last week, saying that he was going to send a question about the Trans Mountain Pipeline, about British Columbia's jurisdictional responsibilities with the pipeline, to court. Can you tell us which court that's going to go to? Is it Court of Appeal or is it the Canadian Supreme Court? And what specifically will be the question that is sent to the judges to consider?
So the options for British Columbia on a constitutional reference question are to send it to BC Supreme Court or the BC Court of Appeal. The decision from the Court of Appeal can potentially be appealed with leave to the Supreme Court of Canada. We're taking legal advice on the best approach for BC. When cases go to the Supreme Court, they tend to be more evidence-based, like the polygamy reference, where you hear a lot from experts and people who have been involved. And when they go to the Court of Appeal, they're more legal-based questions. You've got a set of draft regulations, and you're asking the court, are these going to pass constitutional muster? So we're taking advice from lawyers about the best approach to defend BC's interests in this, and to make sure that our jurisdiction is first of all, protected and respected, and also that we're using it as best as possible to protect our coast from an oil spill and the impact that that would have on tens of thousands of jobs across the province.
The Premier disclosed that the province had approached the federal government about joining in this action. Ottawa said no. Is there some kind of a timetable over this, which this is likely to play out? I mean, do you have a target for getting the question into court and when you hope to get an answer? Yeah,
our hope was that given that the feds had raised questions about our constitutional authority in this area, we thought, we'll go together to the court and we'll get a final answer. They didn't want to do that, and that's fine. And so the timing in terms of how long these things take and how long the courts take with the argument and so on is really dependent on how the question's structured and what the evidence is that we're bringing forward. And we'll be structuring it in a way that ensures that we're protecting BC's constitutional and jurisdictional interests in this matter. We're taking advice on that right now. I hope to have an announcement next week about who our council team is. And then I would imagine it's about a month from then that we would have a final set of answers about where we're going to go, what the question will be, and the process we're going to use.
Chuck Finlayson, another pipeline question. Here he is.
Minister, a question on the BC government's continued opposition to the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion project. I guess I would note that the previous BC government eventually came around to approving the project. The Government of Canada has offered all of its approvals that are required. Now we have your government sort of revisiting what previously seemed to be a done deal. This has set off shockwaves in the business community and in the international capital markets. Are you concerned that our province's reputation, and indeed Canada's reputation, as a place for large-scale industrial investment, particularly in new infrastructure, could be severely tarnished by the continuing uncertainty surrounding this major project.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges and sort of how this gets discussed in the media is exactly what the concern is. So there's no question that the feds have the ability to authorize this pipeline to come into British Columbia. The question is the extent of the authority that British Columbia has to prepare ourselves to ensure that we're prepared for a catastrophic oil spill. And to have regulations in place to ensure accountability in that event. This pipeline has already had a significant spill when a backhoe operator pierced the pipeline and oil spilled into the bay as a result. So we know that this has happened in the past. We reasonably believe that it can happen in the future, and there are tens of thousands of jobs that are dependent. So I appreciate that some people, including perhaps Mr. Finlayson, feel that are asking questions about the extent of our authority to protect against spills, to be ready for spills, to protect those jobs and protect British Columbia creates uncertainty among pipeline operators like Kinder Morgan. But the uncertainty and the devastation that would follow from a catastrophic dilbit spill on tens of thousands of very real jobs that exist in British Columbia right now, tourism, film industry, fisheries, would be devastating. And so we're taking our instructions from the people who work in those industries and ensuring that their jobs are protected and that we're ready to respond in the event of an oil spill. Nobody's contesting the ability of the feds to approve this kind of thing. They made that decision. Our role is to ensure that we're protecting British Columbia's interests.
I seem to recall fairly early on as Attorney General, you also made it clear that the government could not and would not unreasonably hold up permitting on the project, that the province would fulfill its obligations on the project, providing, obviously, the conditions are met and so forth. Is that still the approach the province has taken?
Well, the Attorney General has a couple of roles. One is I'm a member of Cabinet, I'm part of the Executive Council, but also a separate role to ensure that the government adheres to the rule of law, which includes the Constitution. And the Constitution is unambiguous, that the feds have the ability to authorize this pipeline project, and the province can't stop them from doing that, and it can't stop the project. And the case law is that the province can't unduly interfere with that federal jurisdiction. But there's a lot of cases that talk about the co-management, co-role in protecting the environment, especially in areas of the coasts and the shorelines, and provincial responsibility. And there's a great deal of uncertainty around these interprovincial pipelines. And so we want to know the extent of our authority there. We'll act within our lawful authority, and that's what the court reference is all about clearing up, is ensuring that we're acting within the law and within the Constitution. And that's a priority for British Columbians. It's a priority for me as Attorney General, and it's my unique constitutional role in the Cabinet. And I'll fulfill it, and I'll ensure that we're doing that. And the court reference is part of that.
Take a brief break with Attorney General David Eby on Voice of BC. We will be right back. Lots more to talk about. Stay with us, please.
No decision's been made yet on rates. That'll be coming from the attorney, but I think you certainly will know that part of the reason we're bringing in product reform is so that we don't see huge skyrocketing rates that were predicted. We want to keep those rates as affordable as possible, but there are challenges at ICBC, no question.
Wait, stop, don't turn that dial. More's coming up as you're watching Voice of BC on Shaw TV. I'm Andrew Weaver, leader of the BC Green Party.
There are more ways to connect with us at Voice of BC. Email us at vobc@shaw.ca. Follow us on Twitter at Voice of BC. Or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/VOBC on Shaw TV.
Providing my special needs son with the care he needed made it impossible to work outside the home. I felt like I had no choices. Make a Change Canada gave me the opportunity I needed to grow my marketing business with their online training and guidance. Now, I run Gale Force Marketing while still being able to be a full-time parent to my son and provide him with the care he needs. They helped make it possible.
Make a Change Canada is an accredited nonprofit organization with charitable status. Find out how they may be able to empower you with your employment challenges.
The concern right now is not just proportional representation itself, but the very referendum structure. There's not going to be any kind of regional threshold. There's no threshold with respect to turnout. The threshold for passage is 50% plus one. So conceivably, a couple of major cities on the Lower Mainland could decide our entire voting system.
Welcome back to Voice of BC and Attorney General David Eby, and lots to talk about. And let's go back to a couple of questions on ICBC because there, as the attorney said, there are some legislation coming this spring about some changes in ICBC. Bruce Halser, who's a regular on this show and a lawyer himself, has a couple of questions. Here's the first one from Bruce.
One of the solutions to ICBC future rate increases is no-fault auto insurance. You have said that you would not go there, and the last NDP government in BC tried that and backed down. But you have said that you'd be willing to look at caps on damages. Now, we have a general cap in Canada on personal injury damages. Are you talking about something specific for motor vehicle accident damages? Such as the kind of schedule that WCB has? And if you are, isn't that getting close to no-fault insurance?
Some people have called it no-fault light.
Yeah. Well, we've since the question was asked, obviously, we've announced our product reform on ICBC, and that's for basic insurance, that there will be a limit on the amount of pain and suffering award that you can receive for what's being called a minor injury. And that is intended to actually be a minor injury. Sprains and strains, it doesn't even include concussions. It certainly doesn't include brain injuries, broken bones, severe whiplash, all these kinds of things. We've increased the amount of money through the savings that we anticipate through this for rehabilitation of these kinds of injuries. But there is a limit on the pain and suffering award that you can receive for this kind of thing. It's $5,500. In addition, we have the Civil Resolution Tribunal that will be determining at the first stage whether or not, if there's a dispute about whether it's a minor injury or whether it's transitioned into a major injury, they'll be doing the first stage, and then if you want, you can appeal it to the BC Supreme Court. So you're still able to access BC Supreme Court for all non-minor injuries. There's still the existing system, but the savings of diverting those minor injuries from the full court system and using the Civil Resolution Tribunal exceed $1 billion. That is how much we're spending to administer these injuries, and that's why we're able to increase the benefits for rehabilitation and get ICBC back on firm financial footing with some of the other initiatives we have underway. It's unfortunately necessary, and before the election we were told ICBC was going to lose about $11 million on the fiscal period. We found out that that was actually $900 million, so they were off by a fairly significant margin, about 9,000%. So this is a big challenge for us. It's a problem we didn't anticipate that we would have coming into government, but we will deal with it, and we are hurrying to put these changes in place because each dollar that ICBC loses means there's a dollar less available to the finance minister for public programs, and that was a $1.3 billion hole in our budget, and that's a big hole when it comes to public programs.
Follow-up question from Bruce on the tribunal. You've already referred to it. Here's his question.
The Civil Restitution Tribunal, which was generated during the last government, hit the ground running in the last year and has been pretty well received in the legal community. I think I've heard comments from you that you're supportive of it and want to continue it. Do you see this model as working in other areas of law, such as family law? And if so, what kind of timeline would you see to expanding that tribunal to other areas?
So this is a less adversarial system that incurs less legal costs, presumably, as well.
Well, it's designed for people to be able to appear without a lawyer. They can do it online as well, and they don't have to actually physically appear in a courtroom somewhere. It does save time for people. It saves money for people. It saves money for the province, certainly. And they've been dealing with really obnoxious small matters that clog up the courts, strata disputes, small claims matters under $5,000. I think there's great potential for the Civil Resolution Tribunal to be involved in more matters that are they're really not at the level that justifies going to even provincial small claims court because of the time and energy and money involved, but they can help people reach resolution on things that make their lives miserable, a problem with their strata, trying to collect a small debt or a small contract that wasn't honored by somebody. And we can really deliver access to justice because lawyers don't even want to deal with these claims because they can't afford to cover the expenses at their office and represent people on them. So people have to appear by themselves. They're appearing by themselves in court. They're slowing things down. It's really expensive. They're frustrating the judges and the bigger cases that need to get through. So there's a huge potential there, but we're doing it gradually. There is a challenge in Quebec to the authority of the provincial court in Quebec. They've massively expanded the jurisdiction of their court there to hear small claims matters, and so that challenge is going ahead. We're watching that. The courts will tell us how much we can rely on these kinds of tribunals to deal with these smaller matters.
Well, we've moved labor disputes to a labor relations board. We've moved some human rights disputes to tribunals that have a certain expertise. Are you getting heat from members of your own profession over what you're planning on ICBC, what you've said you're going to do?
Yes and no. So there is a group of lawyers that does personal injury work primarily, and a lot of them rely heavily on automotive ICBC work, plaintiff side ICBC work. And it is going to, no question, impact their business, and I'm definitely hearing from them in a very big way. Their advocacy group, the Trial Lawyers Association of BC, has been advocating very effectively, in my opinion, on behalf of their members. And we've been working with them and trying to work with them to the extent that they're willing to ensure that we don't have any unintended consequences of what we need to do. But at the end of the day, we have no choice. The legal costs are too high. The amount of costs to deal with a minor injury is too high. People can't afford to pay the insurance rates that justify or that would pay ICBC enough to administer minor injuries the way that we have. So we're going to make those changes. I hope they come to the table. I hope they stay at the table to have those discussions, but they are upset about that. On the other matters, and as far as the rest of the bar, I think most people in British Columbia, whether they're lawyers or not, understand that for their basic insurance, they want to know that they'll be able to get better if they get hurt. They want to know that people will be held accountable, that bad drivers will pay more and good drivers will pay less. That's another initiative we have underway. So I think most people understand we need to get ICBC under control. They understand there's a big financial problem there.
British Columbia is not breaking new ground on this. In fact, it's one of the last provinces to do some of this. Has it survived? Has this model survived court challenges in other jurisdictions? It
has, and it's certainly been challenged, and we expect that this model will be challenged as well. There's enough financial interest in these minor injury matters on the part of the plaintiff bar that, and they've been pretty clear to us that they intend to challenge it once the rules are in place. But we think they will survive for a couple of reasons. One is, if you go to the Civil Resolution Tribunal, you can still appeal it to Supreme Court. We're not saying you can't go to court. And the second thing is, we know in other provinces that where you're ensuring that people have access to good rehabilitation services, that these types of limits on pain and suffering awards have been accepted by the court for minor injuries.
Another huge file that has to be dealt with this spring, and the House Leader of the government, Mike Farmer, has been telling everybody, is provincial government accommodating the federal government decision to legalize marijuana for recreational purposes, cannabis. A couple of questions about that. Here's the first one from former Cabinet Minister Ida Chong.
Mr. Attorney General, I have heard that those who have marijuana-related convictions from the past are now prohibited from being in the marijuana industry of the future. In fact, they're requesting that their convictions be eliminated or removed to allow them to be involved in the marijuana industry of the future. Wouldn't it just be easier to allow them to participate in the future marijuana industry rather than removing those convictions?
The discussion that's gone on too about pardoning, but for convictions, that's federal, right?
It is, yeah.
The federal government would have to do that. It's not something the provincial government can do.
That's right, it is federal. I mean, Ms. Chong raises an important question. So there are a number of these, I'll generously describe them as gray market operators that have sprung up and are selling marijuana through storefronts in municipalities across BC. So it's a delicate question about how we manage them. Both the Solicitor General and I have been really clear that there should be no advantage for those who are operating illegally in having a head start on those who followed the rules as they existed and are making application to open a store under the new rules with the support of their municipality through a proper licensing process under the federal government's initiative. So I don't think that anyone should have an advantage for having moved illegally, and I don't think that most British Columbians would think that that would be appropriate either.
Good question from Jamie Lawson, University of Victoria Political Science Department, again about pot legalization and how we proceed. Here he is.
With respect to the issue of Peter German's recent reports on the extent of money laundering in the province's casinos, I've got a question about a seemingly unrelated issue, which is the Trudeau government's move to legalize marijuana. Is this problem at the casinos something that has to be watched with respect to disentangling the marijuana industry from organized crime?
A lot of the BC Bud, which is apparently a wonderful product, although I've never inhaled, is produced here in British Columbia by operators all over British Columbia. Are you going to be able to keep them active but organized crime out of it?
It's really clear that one of the potential advantages of legalization is getting organized crime out of the business. Marijuana proceeds were described by the RCMP as jet fuel for organized crime. They use the proceeds from marijuana sales to fund all kinds of terrible activities, ensuring that kids don't have access and ensuring that when the public does use marijuana, that they do so with knowledge of all of the potential risks, and also that the product that they're using is what they expect it to be, and it doesn't have mold or pesticides or so on. So there are lots of advantages that come with a legalization regime, and one of them relates to the questioner's point, which is the opportunity to really ensure that the people who are involved in this industry are not participants in organized crime, not connected with organized crime. We do that on the casino side. The Gaming Policy Enforcement Branch ensures that people who are involved don't have ties to organized crime. We do it on the liquor side. Our liquor regulator ensures that people are pass a fit and proper test to be able to hold a license in British Columbia, and we'll certainly do it on the cannabis side to ensure that organized crime is not involved in this industry in British Columbia anymore.
You confident you can get all this legislation through before summer?
It's a huge challenge. The ICBC legislation alone would be a keystone piece of legislation for any parliamentary session, and we have that and the cannabis as well, which is a massive piece. Our drafters are working overtime, and so are staff and consulting and making sure that we have all the information we need.
Former BC Liberal MLA Judy Tyabji has a question for the Attorney General. She's been promoting this on social media already, so it would be a shame not to ask it. He may even be primed to answer it, but in any event, here she is, Judy Tyabji.
You know, I'm really concerned about the kind of comments that I'm hearing about money laundering and fentanyl from China and Chinese investors, because it might make for a good soundbite. But why don't we leave that to the guy to the south of us to score sound bites and political points? What we should be doing in British Columbia is making new investors welcome. And what I hear over and over from David Eby is the kind of commentary that I feel panders to racists. Maybe I'm a little bit sensitive because of my origins in India, but I keep reading headlines that link Chinese investors to money laundering to drug dealing. That's all I'm seeing from this government. I don't think they're feeling very welcome. You're already chasing out a lot of our resource sector investment. Why chase the Chinese out too?
Well, I mean, it's a bizarre suggestion to me as an MLA with a large Chinese expat community in my constituency that cracking down on money laundering is somehow racist. You know, Ms. Tyabji has her perspective. I will continue with my work in ensuring that the proceeds of crime do not come into our casinos, that the proceeds of crime don't enter our real estate market. And one of the things actually that Ms. Tyabji might find interesting is that the Chinese government is pursuing people in our real estate market who have put the proceeds of crime and corruption in China into our real estate market, and their concern about what's happening here with proceeds of crime from that country and the lack of controls here. They've actually sued people here and recovered proceeds of crime from China. So I think it's I mean, it's a fun, she talks about political talking points. It's a fun political talking point for her, I suppose, but not particularly helpful. When we were talking about the housing crisis, there were lots of people who said talking about the housing crisis, the out-of-control real estate values was racist somehow. It is not. There are as many Chinese Canadian families concerned about whether their kids are going to be able to afford a place to live as there are Canadians of all different backgrounds who live in the Lower Mainland. And I think it is an oversimplification that's not especially helpful.
In your riding, which is Point Grey, I would have to think it has a lot of the high-end homes and the high-end real estate issues that are hit by the government's action, the big taxes that were brought in the budget to tax some of those high-end homes. What kind of reaction you've been getting from your own constituents on this? Do they feel like they're being singled out, or are they thinking it's overdue?
Well, I certainly have questions about the tax on homes valued above $3 million, and it's a step. So the value over $3 million has an additional school tax, and the value over $4 million has an additional surtax beyond that. And the reason for the questions is quite obvious. People want to know what their family budget's going to be, how much it's going to cost them, this kind of thing. The challenge, of course, is that home values, detached home values, especially in this price range, have increased more than 100% in recent years, and the impact of that has been really profound. So we have a group of people who are very, very house wealthy in my constituency, and we have a group of people who will never be able to afford a home in the Lower Mainland, working for minimum wage, schools with inadequate resources for kids, and people living in tents in Jericho and in the woods along the beach and so on. And so the same people who are asking the questions about, okay, what's this tax about, what's it going to be going to, I'm able to tell them it's going into housing, it's going into the schools. You're the same folks who emailed me and said, we need to take action on these things. Your home is appreciated in value more than 100%, and this tax is 0.2% or 0.4%. So I think we have a good case to make. There will be people who it will be unacceptable to them to have any aspect of their house wealth taxed. I understand that. But to achieve the things that we need to do in our schools and in the housing crisis and so on, and given the $1.3 billion hit we took on ICBC, these taxes were necessary, and it's a challenge every time, but I hope that people are able to understand both the benefit that they've had of their houses rising in value because of our safe communities and our good schools, and how the money will be used by our government to make life better in BC.
And there is an option to defer some of these taxes. Selling your home, between selling your home and paying the bill, there is the option of deferring.
And the deferral of the tax is actually subsidized. The loan, functionally, it's a loan from the province until you sell your house. And the interest rate, I believe, is 0.7%, so it's subsidized by the province. So you have people who live in $4 million homes that they own almost outright, receiving a subsidized loan from the province. And that's hard for me to explain to people who are renting a small basement suite in the constituency, too.
Early, too, when government announces major tax measures like this, some of the details still have to be sorted out in regulation. But one of the ones that I think is interesting, I'd be interested in hearing your verdict on it. The government has brought in a speculation tax, which is something new, and one of the things that will be applied to is recreational property here in British Columbia that is owned by people from other provinces. So not just foreigners, but people from Canadians who don't pay income tax in British Columbia. The question I have is there any precedent for this? And is it constitutional to tax Canadians from another province differently from the way you tax British Columbians?
Yeah. So, for example, if you go to university in Quebec as a British Columbia resident, you'll pay a different tuition rate in a Quebec university than a Quebec student. In Prince Edward Island, they have a restriction about how much waterfront property someone that's not from PEI can buy. So there are these kinds of measures across the country. This one tries to recognize that there's a difference. There's been a significant impact on people buying properties, whether for investment purposes or otherwise, in Lower Mainland, especially in certain other markets across the province, and the inability of people who live, work, and pay taxes in the community to find a place to live. And so it's our hope that the proceeds from this tax will be able to build the housing that's needed to deal with that. So when someone engages in an activity and profits from it that causes costs for others, one of the things government can do is say, look, a portion of the profit that you're making from this is going to go to offset the harms that you're creating. And it seems reasonable to ask people who aren't paying these kinds of taxes in BC to step up.
Take a brief break on Voice of BC with the Attorney General, and more to come. Stay with us.
The the Attorney General has got a lot of press for looking into the issue of irregularities at licensed casinos in BC. But we know, just from looking at Chinese language media in BC, that there are unlicensed casinos operating underground. They're actively advertising, hiring dealers. The police must know where they exist. Why hasn't anything been done to shut down these illegal gaming facilities in BC?
Hello, my name is Carol Bellringer, Auditor General of British Columbia, and you are tuned in to one of my very favorite shows, Voice of BC.
Hi, I'm Darvin. I lost my foot in a lawnmower accident. Come on, come on. Today I'm teaming up with the BC Lions to tell kids to play safe.
Cool lion.
Thank you. Go Lions!
What does a lion do?
Run.
Jump. Tackle. Roar. All right, Darvin, show me your roar.
Whatever game you play, play safe. A message from the War Amps.
I've talked to more than a few police officers over the years who say that David Eby is no friend of theirs. But it's the trial lawyers who are the ones who are most upset with David Eby today, given his moves on ICBC. I guess you can say the trial lawyers have been given the EBGBs by what's going on at ICBC.
Yeah, I'd be using that as a clip when he runs for re-election in 2021. Welcome back. And this fall, British Columbia is going to have a referendum by mail ballot on electoral reform. And the government, again, just this week, completed a public consultation on basically asking the British Columbia public what kind of things do you want to see us to deal with on this. You got, I think you have a press release out today, Thursday, saying record feedback.
Yeah, amazingly, it shouldn't be amazing, actually. Of course, British Columbians are engaged in this, but when my colleague Mike Farnworth did the Cannabis consultation and there were 40,000 submissions on that, I thought, well, you know, electoral reform is interesting to a subset of people in the province. We'll be lucky if we get close to that number. About 70,000 people filled out surveys. It took about 16 minutes on average to fill out the survey from all across the province. About 180,000 people visited the website, spent 15 minutes on average on the website learning about what's proposed, and I think that the results really speak to the deep interest that British Columbians have in this, the willingness of people to fill out those surveys and provide, we had 30 organizations provide submissions to us, provide submissions about what the rules should be, what the questions should be, shows that there's a real enthusiasm around having this conversation. And ultimately, this will shape the referendum question, referendum question as well as the process itself. But it'll be British Columbians voting at the end of the day who decide this.
What's the next step from your end? You said question. I gather there may be more than one. When do you roll out the next step on all this?
Yeah, the legislation enables one question or multiple questions on the ballot. My staff have received all the information from the Ministry of Attorney General. They're going through it. They'll produce a report summarizing the information and making recommendations about what the rules should be and what the format of the question or questions should look like. And I think that, and so that report will be released publicly. It will also be presented to Cabinet, and people will see the regulations that come out the other side of Cabinet, whether they follow the recommendations, whether they don't. There'll be accountability in that way. And this feedback process has been invaluable. The only piece that remains outstanding is we have a couple more weeks of consultation with Indigenous communities across the province, and then the consultation process will be closed. The report should be out hopefully by the end of next month. Once that's out, the referendum will take place according to the law by November of
end of April, end of March.
Pardon me?
The report should be out by
end of April for sure.
End of April.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then November is the deadline for holding the referendum.
And will all the public feedback at some point be on the public record so that we'll know what everybody said and how many said what and all that?
Yeah. So the plan right now is we advised all the people who provided the submissions that their submissions would be made public. The results are going to be in terms of the 80,000 people who filled out the surveys. Those results will be part of the report, so people should have a good sense about what we heard.
Well, we'll be doing a show on this a little later in the year when we know a little bit more about it, we hope. But for now, of course, there's still a lot of interest. Witness the amount of feedback the government's already had on it, and some questions. I'm not sure all of these can be answered yet, given that there's still things to be decided. But here's the first one from Bill Thielman.
Attorney General, you're responsible within government for the electoral systems referendum this fall. Yet you campaigned in favor of proportional representation. You've said things on the record about favoring proportional representation. Now you've recused yourself and say you're neutral. How does that square?
Do you think you should take yourself out of the picture because you've already declared your position?
Yeah. So the Premier's asked me to administer the referendum. The Attorney General has a role to play that's neutral and independent of government on many different difficult issues we talked about earlier on the show. This is another example of that. I'm confident that the staff of my ministry can do this. I'm recusing myself from all caucus discussions on this. And, the questionnaire that we put out, Bill and others have suggested it was biased towards proportional representation. I've got letters.
That was my impression from reading it.
Well, interestingly, I've got letters from proportional representation fans who accuse me of betraying their cause because it's so clearly biased towards first past the post and overcomplicating the matter of proportional representation and failing to answer key criticisms of proportional representation. So if both sides are unhappy with the survey and 70,000 people filled out the survey, I'm okay with that result. It'd be nice to please everybody, but that's difficult in politics.
Andrew McLeod of the Tyee, another good question. Here he is.
With the referendum on electoral reform, I'm wondering what you will do if the turnout is small. For instance, it might get 51% support, but in a situation where only, say, 30% vote. I'm wondering, then what?
We've not had a referendum like this in BC with a turnout that is lower than a municipal election result. I think that the results
like
from the consultation, right? Yeah, that's right. So they've all exceeded that. Okay. And that includes some pretty arcane topics that have been canvassed by mail-in ballot. I think the interest in this is huge. I think the consultation reflects that. I think turnout will be great. And I'm really grateful that the turnout on the consultation was so high, because I think it does answer some of the questions about whether or not people will turn out and vote, whether or not people are engaged, whether or not they know about this happening. I mean, just for context, about 5,000 people filled out the questionnaire related to their children's report cards. And 70,000 people filling out questionnaires, taking 16 minutes to do it, gives you an indication of the level of interest in this.
Bruce Halser, who is actually a supporter of electoral reform, well, I'll declare that up front because people have seen him regularly on this show. And he has a question about the rules, the way the government's framed this issue. Here is Bruce.
There's been a lot of talk about the referendum rules and a lot of concern in the Interior that although it may have been undemocratic to have a 60% threshold to pass electoral reform, there was some fairness in requiring it to also pass in 50% of constituencies. You've eliminated that, and you've opened up the possibility that a new electoral system could be brought in with 50% support of the population, but a minority of ridings in the province supporting it. How do you justify that if that happens?
And the concern, as I understand it, springs from the fact that one option for electoral reform, and not all of them, would reduce the number of individual constituencies in the legislature in order to create proportionality. So the Interior, under one model, the North and the Interior, number of seats they have in the House now, which is about 24, would be cut in half. And that, I think, is the real concern that you need to address.
I have heard very clearly from already at this stage, certainly from the opposition, various commentators and so on, the concern about rural representation, the need to ensure rural representation is one of the values that's respected in this process. And so I've heard it loud and clear. It will certainly be part of the report and recommendations to Cabinet when setting the regulations, and to the extent that I'm able to, in the absence of the report being done yet, in the absence of the rules being done, or the ballot question being set, I can assure people that I have definitely heard that, and it will be incorporated into any ballot questions or systems that are put forward. This concern about will rural constituencies not have a local MLA? Will they be disenfranchised in some way?
Andrew McLeod again, another question that's not yet resolved, that there certainly is some discussion on. Here is Andrew McLeod from the Tyee.
Following the Brexit vote in the UK, I was interested to learn that a company here in Victoria, Aggregate IQ, was doing work for one of the sides in that debate. One of the things that was interesting to me about that was that in the UK, the candidates and the third-party advertisers have to say who their suppliers are. As far as I know, we don't have any such rule in BC, so you can't learn if there is a company like Aggregate IQ doing work for a party or another group in an election or a referendum campaign. I'm wondering if you think we need that kind of rule and if you would consider bringing one in.
So, and I'm thinking particularly of this referendum. Presumably there will be rules on spending and funding and disclosure and all that coming, patterned on the existing Election Act or differently?
This was one of the questions that we asked British Columbians in the consultation, what rules should be in place and third parties that are attempting to influence the vote in one direction or the other. Should we be funding a yes side and a no side, or a pro side and an anti side, or a keep the system or a change the system? And so those are questions we asked. I haven't reviewed the feedback yet. For the specific suggestion, I've not heard that suggestion before. It's an interesting one. I know that having participated in elections, that we have a list of all our expenditures that we're accountable to Elections BC for. But Andrew's absolutely right. We don't have to post that somewhere to tell. Certainly, if we, as a government, end up funding keep the current system, change the system groups, then they will be accountable to government for the spending and ensuring that the expenses match up with the money that they receive from government. I don't know how FOI would apply to that, but it's an interesting question. I'll look into it. It might be part of the feedback that people have given us.
If you're interested in this one, if you look on the internet, I think you'll see there's already a no group that is opposed to electoral reform, out and organized. Bill Thielman's involved in it, obviously. I believe there's at least one and maybe two yes groups. So out already. Obviously still hypothetical at this point, but getting ready for a campaign in the fall, and the BC Liberals have already indicated they're going to get involved in opposing, and the government and the Green Party has already indicated that in some form or another they will be campaigning for. Will all that be captured by whatever kind of restrictions we have on spending and campaigning as well?
Absolutely. There will be rules in place around spending, around transparency and accountability for that. Absolutely.
Yeah. Question from the Green Party, Christina Winter. Another question about how this is going to work. Here she is.
This November, Elections BC will be administering a mail-in ballot referendum on proportional representation. Mr. Eby, how does your government intend to ensure the integrity of the proportional representation process?
So the ballot, as I recall, gets mailed to people's homes, and they're given a period of time to answer and mail it back. And from past experience, Elections BC has an auditing system to make sure that you actually got a ballot and you actually voted once, correct?
Yes. We're entirely reliant, and appropriately so, on Elections BC as an independent agency to prevent fraud and to ensure the integrity of the process. They've been able to do that in past mail-in ballots. I have confidence they'll be able to do that, and we'll provide them with the resources that they need to get that done. They use safeguards like the two-envelope system with an envelope that has a signature and a birth date on it, for example, to prevent someone from intercepting your mail and filing it on your behalf. They do random audits and spot checks and so on. We'll be reliant on them to set up those safeguards, and they haven't given us any reason to believe that we shouldn't have confidence in the integrity of the mail-in ballot process.
Remind me why you went for ballot by mail rather than a go to the ballot box kind of referendum.
We had thought initially that we would save people time and trouble and potentially money as well, coupling it up with the municipal election, so that people, when they went to vote municipally, would also vote for the referendum process. What we found out was we'd have to, because it's a different voters list between the referendum and municipal elections, we'd have to have separate staff, separate voters list. We'd be competing for hiring with municipal staff, and municipal elections have lower turnout. And so when we looked at it, mail-in ballots had higher turnout, it was cheaper, and we were able to do it on a different timeline. We weren't tied to the municipal, and we avoided the possibility of really diverting people's attention from the municipal issues right into a PR issue.
You're right. I heard that from local government leaders, that the municipal elections are for municipal issues, and they weren't particularly interested in having it muddied by a big provincial issue that might affect turnout or distract people. I will go to back to Bill Thielman. This is another electoral financing issue, and just because there were so many questions on this, we probably got more on the show on that than people expected, but here's Bill.
Attorney General, the BC NDP government with Green Party support has made major changes to ban corporate and union donations to political parties in BC. But there's also changes been made on the municipal front, the same kind of ban, but municipal parties and candidates don't get any tax credit or any public subsidy, which provincial parties are going to get. That seems unfair to me. Is it something you'll look at rectifying in the near future?
Big year for local government too. It's election year for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no prohibition on municipal governments providing that kind of support. I don't believe any of them are, though.
Okay, so it would be up to them to do it if they wanted to. Sonia Furstenau, House Leader for the Greens, here she is.
Hello, Minister Eby. I have a question for you about the corporate registry and being able to search that registry by director name. You, in your speech to Transparency International, actually identified this as a problem, that people can't access the corporate registry by name of director. In Shawnigan, this would have really helped us to determine who were the real owners of the landfill up there, and so it would be a great step for you to take to make that registry searchable by director name.
The reference to Shawnigan is the issue that got her into public life, which was a battle over a quarry in her constituency, or what's now her constituency at Shawnigan Lake. What do you say?
I think it's a great idea.
Of course, you've got so little on your plate,
well,
too.
One of the challenges with government is there's so many things that need to be done, and only so much time and only so many staff is something I'm learning very quickly. One of the big changes that we're starting with in terms of registries is the land title registry. It was announced in the budget. Now people will have to disclose who the actual beneficial owner is of property in British Columbia. That's a very important change to ensure a couple things. And there are all kinds of reasons why the actual owner of property might be concealed for business or personal reasons. It might be owned by a corporation. All kinds of legitimate reasons why it might happen, but there are also some problems that knock on from that, one of which is it's really hard to do tax enforcement, it's really hard to do anti-money laundering enforcement, and it's really hard to figure out what's actually happening in the property market. And so we're following the lead of London, the UK, on this, and ensuring that the actual owner of property is listed in the land title registry as a transparency measure. My colleague Carol James is also working with the Securities Commission and ensuring that penalties that are levied are on people engaged in securities fraud or corporate fraud are actually collected by the agency. And
novel idea.
And and another piece of that corporate accountability ultimately will be beneficial ownership, like there is in Alberta, and a registry that's searchable by that. But we're one step at a time.
A little bit of time left. Dermot Travis, Integrity BC. This is a question about FOI. Here he is.
One of the concerns, and you've probably seen it yourself, that has been expressed, Bob Mackin frequently tweets on the issue, the cost that the government is estimating for honoring access to information requests that are put in by journalists and the public. Do you think that this could be revisited, given that sometimes those costs are quite prohibitive, and frankly, when it comes to electronic documents, more than likely unnecessary?
And in fairness to Dermot, I'll point out that he taped that question for us before the government announced this week a public consultation on FOI.
Yeah, and a good opportunity for him to raise that issue. There are a lot of issues around FOI reform. I sat on the committee last session that was examining those changes, and so there's lots for us to do there.
Didn't give the minister much time to answer that last question. I do very much appreciate David Eby coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Vaughn.
You're very, very busy. Thanks for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature, BC politics into your living room. Good night.
The following is a community access program. While this program does not necessarily reflect the views of Shaw or its employees, Shaw is proud to support local producers and share local voices, ideas, and opinions. To find out more about community access television,